This story starts on a rain-soaked night in the Oregon woods, with an 11-year-old girl, her grieving grandfather, and a secret rescue that just might heal more than wounds. As Ellie risks everything to save a wild bobcat, she finds herself tangled between loyalty and compassion, facing fears that run deeper than the storm outside. If you've ever needed a reason to believe in second chances, or wondered what courage really looks like, this story is for you. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and please hit like and subscribe to the channel if you want to support more true stories of healing, hope, and wild hearts. Let's dive in. The old cabin at the edge of the woods had never felt more cut off from the world than on that late July night. Rain hammered the tin roof, each drop like a hurried footstep across the ceiling. Trees groaned and bent under the force of the wind, their silhouettes wild and twisted by the flicker of lightning. Inside, the air vibrated with the deep rumble of thunder, a sound that made Ellie shrink deeper into her borrowed flannel pajamas. She was 11 years old, newly arrived from Portland, her suitcase still zipped tight under the bed. Just a week earlier, she'd lived in an apartment surrounded by the hum of city traffic, streetlights glowing against her window, the muffled shouts of neighbors below. Here, everything was different. The silence between storms was so total, it felt like a sound itself. Her grandfather, Hank, paced the uneven planks of the living room floor, boots echoing. He was tall, his frame made hard by years of work and loss, his gray beard still smelling faintly of smoke from the wood stove. He muttered to himself, scowling at the windows that rattled in their frames. "Storm's blowing in trouble," he grumbled, eyes darting to the shadows beyond the glass. "Dangerous things come out from the woods on nights like this." Ellie sat on the faded couch, clutching a mug of cocoa that had long since gone cold. She watched Hank, trying to read his moods the way she once studied her father's face for clues. But Hank's expressions were as unpredictable as the storm, fury and sorrow, regret and protectiveness, all wrestling for control. On the mantel, a photograph in a cracked wooden frame showed two men younger and happier, Hank and a friend, arms slung around each other, rifles slung over their shoulders. Ellie had noticed it on her first day, the glass dusty, the smile on Hank's face so unlike the man she now knew. A sudden crash made them both jump. The storm had blown open the porch door, slamming it against the side of the cabin. Hank cursed, stomping to secure it, while Ellie's heart pounded in her ears. The wind's howl seemed to carry other sounds too, high, thin, and desperate. Ellie set her mug down and went to the rain-blurred window. Outside, lightning streaked the sky, revealing the swaying black shapes of fir trees and tangled underbrush. Somewhere out there, she heard it again. A cry, not quite human, not quite animal, slicing through the night. She strained to hear. The sound was so faint she almost doubted it, until it rose again, sharp and wounded, then cut off as if the night itself had swallowed it whole. "Did you hear that?" Ellie called to her grandfather, but Hank was still wrestling with the porch door, his back to her. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, peering into the darkness, goosebumps pricking her arms. Somewhere in the blackness, something or someone was suffering. That night, after the storm eased and the house grew quiet, Ellie lay in the unfamiliar bed, blankets tucked up to her chin. She tried to sleep, but the echo of that cry kept pulling her back. Every time thunder rolled overhead, she imagined eyes watching her from the woods, wild and unknowable. Hank's voice drifted from the kitchen, deep and low. He was on the phone, talking to someone, a neighbor maybe, or one of his old hunting buddies. She heard words like bigger than usual and tracks by the creek, but it was the bitterness in his voice that caught her attention. It wasn't just the storm that haunted him. It was something older, a wound that ran deeper than any rain. Long after the cabin went dark, Ellie stared up at the ceiling and tried to remember what it felt like to be safe. She missed her parents, missed the city's warmth and noise. Out here, everything seemed sharper, shadows deeper, fears larger. But under it all, something else flickered: curiosity. Why did Hank fear the woods so much? What was he really afraid of? As dawn struggled through the trees, Ellie finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her dreams tangled with the storm's fury and the echo of that wounded cry. In the morning, a thick hush had settled over the world, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ellie sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The memory of last night pressed heavy on her chest. A storm, a scream, the endless woods. And just for a moment, as she looked out at the glistening leaves and broken branches, she thought she saw a shadow slip through the trees at the edge of the clearing. Whatever had cried out in the storm was still out there. And Ellie knew, without understanding why, that she would find it, no matter what secrets or dangers lay waiting in the wild. The morning after the storm, the world looked freshly scrubbed but battered. Limbs littered the yard, and Hank was outside already, inspecting for damage with a flashlight and a frown. Ellie ate her cereal in silence, eyes flicking to the edge of the woods every few seconds. All night, she'd been haunted by the sound she'd heard. The wounded, pleading cry. It pulled at her, a stubborn thread she couldn't ignore. As Hank's back turned and he grumbled over the bent gutter, Ellie slid out the door and into the wet grass, heart racing. She paused at the tree line, letting the chill air bite her skin. Every instinct screamed that she shouldn't go. Don't wander off. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. But Portland was 1,000 miles away, and rules felt different out here. Ellie picked her way through the sodden brush, shoes squishing, her pajama pants already soaked. Birds flitted in the undergrowth, startled by her presence. With every step, she remembered Hank's warnings about the woods, about what could be lurking just out of sight. She was almost ready to turn back when she heard it, a faint, rasping whimper not far ahead. Ellie crept forward, parting the ferns with trembling fingers. The sound grew louder, painful, desperate. Then she saw it. Nestled in a hollow beneath an overturned log, half hidden by mud and leaves, was a small bobcat, its spotted fur matted with blood and rain. The animal's side heaved, each breath shallow and ragged. Its eyes, wild and golden, flashed fear and pain as Ellie approached. She froze, not daring to move. She'd seen pictures of bobcats before, always fierce, always dangerous, according to Hank's stories. But this one looked nothing like a monster. It looked defeated, vulnerable. "Hey there," she whispered, voice barely a breath. The bobcat flinched, baring its teeth in a silent snarl, but it was too weak to move. For a long moment, Ellie hovered between terror and compassion. She remembered all the times she'd brought home stray cats back in Portland, all the hours she'd spent coaxing frightened animals out from under cars. But this was different. This was wild. This was forbidden. A branch cracked behind her, and Ellie spun, heart thudding. No one there, just the endless woods watching. She knelt, moving slowly. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." Her voice shook, but she pressed on, inching closer. Up close, she could see the wound. A deep gash along the animal's back leg, likely from a trap or barbed wire. Blood still oozed, sticky and dark. If Hank found out, he'd never forgive her. His hatred for bobcats was legendary, a scar that ran all the way back to a story Ellie had only heard in fragments. Something about a friend, a hunting trip, a night gone wrong. She didn't know the details, only that the anger still smoldered. Ellie hesitated, glancing back toward the cabin. She should run. She should call for help. But she didn't. Instead, she slid off her flannel shirt and, as gently as she could, wrapped it around the bobcat. The animal hissed, feebly clawing, but it was too exhausted to resist. Carefully, awkwardly, Ellie gathered it into her arms. It was heavier than she expected, all muscle and fear. Staggering under the weight, she made her way to the old tool shed behind the cabin, an outbuilding Hank rarely visited since his arthritis had gotten worse. She nudged open the warped door and slipped inside, heart hammering. The shed was dim and smelled of oil and rust. Spiderwebs hung in the corners. Ellie cleared a spot among the rags and empty boxes, laying the bobcat down as gently as possible. For a moment, they just stared at each other, Ellie shaking with adrenaline, and the bobcat, eyes wide, sides heaving. She found a clean towel, some peroxide from an old first aid kit, and her mother's sewing scissors from her suitcase. With trembling hands, she set about cleaning the wound, pouring the peroxide over the gash. The bobcat jerked, teeth bared in silent agony, but Ellie murmured soft apologies, her voice breaking. "You're okay. You're okay. I'm here." She worked in silence, heart thumping, her mind racing. If Hank came looking for her, if he found out. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, breathing hard. The animal was alive, but barely. She reached out, gently stroking its ear with the tip of her finger. "You need a name," she whispered. "You look like a Bruno." "Yeah, Bruno. You're tough, aren't you?" The bobcat blinked, not understanding, but Ellie smiled through her tears. The next few minutes were a blur of makeshift care, bandaging the wound with strips of towel, offering water in an old tuna can, whispering soothing nonsense. Bruno watched her, suspicious but too weak to fight. As the sun crept higher, Ellie realized she'd been gone too long. She wiped her hands on her jeans, promising Bruno she'd be back. "Don't go anywhere, okay? Please, just stay hidden." She slipped out of the shed, glancing around. Hank's truck was gone, probably into town for supplies. Relief flooded her, but dread followed close behind. What if someone else saw? What if Bruno didn't make it? All morning, Ellie checked on the shed every chance she got, smuggling bits of chicken and a bottle of water. Each time Bruno was there, watching, wary, but alive. As dusk settled and the world turned gold and shadow, Ellie sat with her journal, hands shaking. She'd never kept such a big secret before. The fear of discovery was nearly as sharp as the fear for Bruno's life. But there was something else, too. A spark of hope. For the first time since arriving, she felt needed, connected, brave. She finished her journal entry and peered out the window at the shed, whispering a silent promise to her new friend and to herself. No matter what happened next, she wouldn't let him down. Nightfall in the Oregon woods was never truly silent. After the thunderstorm, a heavy hush blanketed the cabin, but Ellie's thoughts churned, restless as the wind that rattled the roof. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant cry of an owl, set her nerves on edge. She kept glancing at her bedroom window, half expecting to see Hank's stern face or the golden glint of Bruno's wild eyes. Dinner was a quiet affair. Hank stewed in his chair, spoon scraping his plate, lost in thought. Occasionally he shot Ellie a searching look, as if sensing the change in the air. the secret pressing between them like a wedge. After clearing the dishes, Hank poured himself a measure of whiskey and settled into his armchair by the fire. The lamplight flickered over the lines on his face, making him look both older and somehow more fragile. Ellie lingered at the table, her mind drifting back to the shed. Was Bruno warm enough? Had he tried to chew through the bandages? Did he think she'd abandoned him? She was snapped from her thoughts when Hank called out, "You're quiet tonight, Ellie. Trouble sleeping?" Ellie forced a shrug. "Just tired from the storm, I guess." Hank grunted. "You'll get used to it. Out here, the wild never really sleeps." He sipped his whiskey, gaze distant. "There's things in those woods you don't want to meet after dark. You remember that, all right?" Ellie nodded, but guilt twisted in her gut. She wanted to ask about his old friend, about why he hated bobcats so much. But the words stuck in her throat. Later, in the safety of her room, Ellie pulled her journal from beneath her pillow. It had become her lifeline in this strange new world, the only place she could untangle her thoughts. Tonight, her handwriting was hurried and messy. "Dear Mom, if you could see me now, you'd never believe it. I saved a wild animal, a real bobcat. He's hurt, but I'm trying to help him. I named him Bruno. I know Grandpa would be furious if he found out, but I can't just let Bruno die. Is that wrong?" She paused, pen trembling. For a moment she wished she could hear her mother's gentle voice, reassuring her that compassion was never wrong, even when it was complicated. Down the hall, Hank's voice boomed, startling her. He was on the phone, speaking with his hunting buddies. Ellie crept out of bed and pressed her ear to the door. "Yeah, I told you, Bill. Tracks all around the creek. Must be that bobcat come back. Killed my best friend. Damn near tore him apart. Ain't a beast in these woods deserves mercy, not after that." The words stung. Ellie clutched her journal tight, heart pounding. She pictured Bruno, trembling in the dark shed, and her grandfather, locked in his pain and memories. Was she betraying him by keeping this secret? Or was she doing what was right? That night, sleep didn't come easy. She tossed and turned, haunted by the echo of Hank's stories and the weight of her own guilt. She dreamed of Bruno calling out for help and of Hank, rifle in hand, searching for a monster that didn't exist. When dawn came, gray and cold, Ellie dressed quietly and slipped outside. She circled the cabin, glancing over her shoulder. The shed loomed in the morning mist, its door barely visible through the brambles. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and old oil. Bruno lay curled on the towels, breathing shallowly but awake. His eyes met hers, wary but less wild than before. Ellie knelt, whispering, "Hey, buddy, you made it through the night." She changed his bandages, hands shaking with fear and hope. The wound was still angry, but the bleeding had slowed. Bruno licked the water she offered, tongue rough and pink. "Oh, Grandpa's wrong about you," she murmured. "You're not a monster. You're just scared, like me." After tending to Bruno, Ellie sat in the shed, writing in her journal by a slant of dusty sunlight. She poured out her confusion and shame, her loyalty split between the wounded bobcat and the wounded man who raised her father. "I wish Grandpa could understand. Bruno isn't evil. He's hurt and alone, just like Grandpa after his friend died. Why is it so hard for people to forgive, animals or each other?" As the days passed, Ellie's secret became a weight she carried everywhere. She jumped at every creak of the cabin, every shout from Hank. She began to lie, saying she was out picking wildflowers or skipping stones at the creek, when she was really feeding Bruno scraps and whispering encouragement. At night, She heard Hank recount the same story to anyone who would listen. How the bobcat ambushed his best friend. How the woods were full of eyes and claws. How nothing good ever came out of the wild. Ellie knew he was trying to protect her, but it felt like a wall growing higher between them. One evening, after a tense dinner, Hank pulled a battered photo album from the shelf and beckoned her over. "Come here, Ellie. You should know what happened." They sat side by side as he flipped through the pages, stopping on an old photograph. Two men in camouflage, smiling, rifles in hand, a dog at their feet. "That's me and Tom, your dad's godfather. He was the bravest man I ever knew." Ellie listened as Hank told the story. How a hunt turned tragic. How he blamed himself for not watching Tom's back. "That bobcat didn't just take Tom. It took everything I thought I knew about these woods." She wanted to say something, to tell him about Bruno, but fear kept her silent. Afterward, as Hank went to bed, Ellie sat alone with the photo, tears prickling her eyes. In the darkness, the woods outside pulsed with hidden life. In the shed, Bruno waited, a silent secret. And in her heart, Ellie realized she was no longer just hiding a wild animal. She was holding the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could heal wounds older than her own. Some mornings, the woods around Hank's cabin seemed to hold their breath, sunlight sifting gently through the fir branches, shadows lingering like secrets. Ellie stood at the back porch, torn between fear and anticipation, her gaze fixed on the old tool shed. There, beneath warped boards and rusty hinges, her secret waited, alive and fragile. She listened for Hank's footsteps. He was still inside, his voice drifting through an open window as he muttered about firewood and chores. Seizing her chance, Ellie hurried across the dew-soaked yard, arms loaded with a fresh towel, a can of tuna, and a battered flashlight just in case. She slipped inside the shed, breath fogging in the cool morning air. Bruno stirred at the sound, lifting his head. His golden eyes met hers, uncertain but no longer filled with wild panic. Ellie knelt beside him, keeping her movements slow and gentle. "Morning, Bruno," she whispered, pushing a bowl of water toward him. "You made it another night. I knew you would." Bruno regarded her warily, but lapped at the water with quick, cautious flicks of his tongue. The wound on his leg looked better, less swollen, the angry red now fading to pink beneath her makeshift bandage. Ellie smiled, relief fluttering in her chest. "Good boy. You're tougher than anyone thinks." Over the next several days, a delicate trust grew between girl and bobcat. Ellie came to him at sunrise and dusk, always speaking softly, always moving slow. She learned the patterns of his breathing, the way his ears flicked at every noise, the warning growl that meant enough. When she offered food, Bruno's hunger sometimes overcame his fear. He'd inch closer, muscles coiled, before darting forward to snatch a piece of chicken from her fingers. Each small victory felt like a miracle. Ellie chronicled every change in her journal, from the first time Bruno let her touch his paw to the morning he accepted a treat without flinching. She poured her pride and hope onto the pages, drawing little hearts and paw prints in the margins. "Bruno let me clean his wound today without hissing. His eyes are so bright now. I think he's starting to trust me. Or maybe he just likes tuna. Either way, it feels like we're both getting braver." The shed became Ellie's sanctuary, a place where the walls between fear and hope, wild and tame, seemed thin enough to cross. Sometimes she'd sit beside Bruno in silence, watching the dust motes swirl in slanted sunlight, feeling a quiet connection bloom. She told him stories of city life, of school and soccer, of the parents she missed and the friends she left behind. Bruno, for his part, listened with slow blinks, as if he understood every word, but secrecy weighed heavy. Hank grew more suspicious as the days passed. He'd watch Ellie from under thick brows, questioning her about her long walks and her muddy shoes. "You're not getting into trouble out there, are you?" he asked one afternoon, voice sharp. Ellie shook her head, careful to keep her gaze steady. "Just exploring. You always said the woods were full of things to see." He grunted, unconvinced. "There's things in those woods you don't understand, Ellie. You keep close to the house, hear me?" She nodded, heart pounding, guilt biting at her heels as she escaped to the shed. Inside, Bruno's recovery continued. His limp lessened. His appetite grew. Ellie delighted in each sign of healing, feeling her loneliness lift each time Bruno accepted her touch. One day, after she placed a bit of roast chicken on the floor, Bruno surprised her. Instead of grabbing the food and retreating, he nudged her hand with his nose, a quick, trusting gesture that made her laugh out loud. "Oh, Bruno, you're just a big softy, aren't you?" she whispered, blinking back tears. The moment was so small, so precious, she wrote about it that night in her journal with trembling hands. Still, shadows lurked. At night, Ellie lay awake, wrestling with fear. What if Hank discovered the truth? What if someone else saw her sneaking food to the shed? The secret pressed on her chest, heavy as a stone, but she couldn't turn back. Bruno needed her, and she, in a way she barely understood, needed him. She began to notice changes in herself. She stood taller, spoke with more confidence, even as the lies piled up. At school, she'd always been quiet, the kid who melted into the background. But here, in the Oregon wilds, with a wounded bobcat depending on her, Ellie felt strong, capable, brave. On the 7th morning, the sky bright and blue after days of rain, Ellie brought a fresh piece of salmon to the shed. She found Bruno pacing restlessly, tail twitching, muscles tense. "Easy, Bruno," she murmured, dropping to her knees. "You're safe, I promise." He froze, then padded toward her, accepting the food from her hand. For the first time, he didn't retreat. Instead, he lingered, sniffing her fingers, his breath warm and damp on her skin. Ellie's heart soared. She realized then that kindness could tame even the fiercest fear, hers and Bruno's. Maybe, she thought, the old stories weren't all true. Maybe not everything wild was dangerous. She ran her hand gently over Bruno's head, feeling the roughness of his fur, the strength in his shoulders. "We're going to get through this," she promised. "Together." Outside, the woods sang with birdsong and hope. For a brief, perfect moment, Ellie believed that anything was possible. For almost 2 weeks, Ellie lived in 2 worlds, one filled with the ordinary rhythms of her grandfather's house, the other crackling with the secret life in the toolshed. Each morning she checked on Bruno, coaxing him to eat, cleaning his wound, whispering promises that he was safe. Every night, she wrote in her journal, filling pages with her fears and hopes, sketching Bruno's face in the margins. But secrets, like wounds, have a way of festering. It started with small things: a missing kitchen towel, a half-eaten roast, muddy tracks by the shed door. Hank's sharp eyes missed nothing. One afternoon, he caught Ellie coming in late, her shoes caked with mud, the smell of canned tuna clinging to her hands. "What are you up to out there?" he demanded, voice gruff. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his shadow blocking the sunlight. Ellie's mind raced for an excuse. "Just exploring the creek." I like the birds. Hank grunted, unconvinced, but let her pass. She barely breathed until she made it to her room. But she knew she was running out of time. That evening, Hank grew restless, muttering to himself as he walked the perimeter of the yard, flashlight beams slicing through the dusk. Ellie watched from her window, dread gnawing at her stomach. The storm had returned in the distance, thunder rumbling like a threat. After dinner, Hank slammed his mug on the table, making Ellie jump. Something's not right. I've seen tracks, big ones, near the shed. You been out there, Ellie? Her throat closed. No, she managed, but her voice sounded small, guilty. Don't lie to me. Hank's tone was sharper than she'd ever heard. You stay away from that shed, you hear? Nothing good in there. I'll check it myself in the morning. Panic shot through her. If Hank found Bruno, she knew what would happen. She barely slept that night, listening to the wind batter the house, her mind running in circles. At dawn, she raced outside. The woods were shrouded in gray mist, everything damp and cold. Ellie crept to the shed, heart pounding. Inside, Bruno lay curled in a corner, watching her with tired eyes. His wound was healing, but he was still weak, still vulnerable. I'm so sorry, Bruno, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. I'll find a way to protect you, I promise. But there was no time. As she finished changing his bandage, the shed door burst open. Hank stood in the doorway, face thunderous, rifle slung over his shoulder. For a split second, no one moved. The world held its breath. Then Hank's eyes fell on Bruno, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. You've been hiding this thing? His voice was a growl, shaking with anger and something deeper, betrayal. Ellie scrambled to shield Bruno, arms outstretched. Please, Grandpa, he's hurt. He's not dangerous. He's just scared. Scared. Hank barked a harsh laugh. That's a killer. You know what these beasts have done. I told you what happened to Tom, your father's godfather. One of these things tore him apart. Ellie shook her head, voice trembling but strong. He's not a monster. He's just hurt, like you were after you lost Tom. He needs help, not hate. For a moment, Hank just stood there, hands shaking, the rifle lowering but not put away. The shed was thick with the scent of fear and rain. Ellie felt the world tipping, all her courage burning in her chest. You've been sneaking around, lying to me, risking your life for this animal? Hank's voice cracked, the anger warring with grief. You don't know what you've done, Ellie. She stared at him, tears streaming down her face, but her voice didn't waver. You're wrong, Grandpa. I know exactly what I've done. I saved him because nobody else would. Because he deserves a chance just like you did. A heavy silence fell. The rain tapped on the tin roof, the only sound in the world. Ellie could see the struggle in Hank's eyes, rage, pain, old memories clawing their way up. Finally, Hank turned away, shoulders slumped. You get out of here, he said, voice hollow. Go to the house. Now. Ellie hesitated, but Bruno gave a low, pitiful mew. She knelt, pressing her hand gently to his side. It's okay, Bruno. I'll come back. I promise. She slipped past Hank, brushing against his rough flannel. He didn't look at her, just stared at the floor, lost in a war only he could fight. Back in the house, Ellie collapsed on her bed, heart hammering. She'd never felt so alone, or so sure she'd done the right thing. The storm broke outside, rain lashing the windows. In the shed, Bruno was alone, facing whatever fate Hank chose for him. And in the heavy, cold silence of the cabin, Ellie and Hank sat on opposite sides of a growing chasm, 2 generations divided by old wounds, fear, and a wild animal neither of them could let go. She wrote in her journal that night, the page blurring with tears. He knows. I can't undo it. But I won't regret saving Bruno. Not ever. Maybe now Grandpa will see that everyone, even a bobcat, deserves a second chance. But as thunder rattled the glass, Ellie wondered if the courage to save one creature was enough to heal a lifetime of pain. The night after everything changed, the house felt colder than ever. Hank hardly spoke. He paced from room to room, his face drawn and unreadable. Ellie's secret had exploded into the open, and now the silence between them was thick as the forest outside, humming with old pain. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, hugging her journal to her chest. The storm had passed, leaving the woods dripping and raw, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm raged, a silent, invisible one. Ellie could feel it in the way Hank avoided her eyes, in the way he slammed cupboard doors, in the way his heavy boots echoed on the floor. For hours, Ellie just listened, to the ticking clock, to the wind against the windows, to her own heart beating. She wanted to run to Bruno, to make sure Hank hadn't hurt him, but she was afraid. Afraid of what she'd find, afraid of what her grandfather might say or do next. Mostly, she was afraid of losing both of them. When darkness finally fell, Hank didn't sit at the table with her for supper. He just mumbled something and disappeared onto the porch, where the glow of his cigarette lit his face in brief, angry flashes. Ellie ate alone, food tasteless in her mouth. Later, when the house was still, Hank wandered back inside, rubbing his tired eyes. His gaze lingered on Ellie, and for a moment she thought he might speak. Instead, he picked up another log and fed it to the fire, staring into the flames. On a strange impulse, Ellie left her journal on the arm of the couch before heading to bed. She didn't know why. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was a plea. She climbed under the covers and waited, the pages lying there like an open wound. Long after she'd gone, Hank found it. At first he grumbled at the mess, intending to toss it aside, but then he saw his own name on the page, written in Ellie's careful looping script. Dear Grandpa, I'm sorry I lied to you. I never wanted to hurt you or make you angry. I just wanted to help Bruno, because he was hurt and nobody else would save him. I know you're scared of bobcats, and I know what happened to Tom. But I wish you could see Bruno the way I do. He's not a monster. He's just scared and alone, like I was when I first came here. Sometimes I think we're all just trying to survive. Please don't hate him. Please don't hate me either. Hank sat down heavily in his old chair, the journal open on his knees. He read page after page, Ellie's fears and hopes pouring out in her honest, trembling voice. He saw drawings of Bruno, first wild, then gentler, his wounds healing under Ellie's care. He read confessions of loneliness, doubts about fitting in, worries that he'd never really welcome her. As the firelight flickered, Hank's face softened. Memories drifted up, memories he'd spent years burying. He saw himself as a boy, small and shivering in these same woods, clutching a wounded fawn to his chest. He'd nursed it back to health, hiding it from his own hard father, believing even the wildest things deserved kindness. But somewhere along the way, life had hardened him. Tom's death, the years alone, the fear that everything he loved would eventually be taken from him. He'd built walls to keep the world out, and now his granddaughter was on the other side. He closed the journal and stared into the fire, the flames dancing like the past. Ellie's words echoed in his mind, Sometimes I think we're all just trying to survive." She was right. He could see it now, in her gentle courage, in the way she'd risked everything to save something small and wounded. A log popped in the fireplace, scattering sparks. Hank blinked, wiping his eyes. Upstairs, Ellie lay awake, heart pounding. She listened for footsteps, for anger, for anything. But the house was quiet. She wondered if she'd gone too far, if she'd pushed Hank away for good. She finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of Bruno's golden eyes and her grandfather's shadow flickering in the firelight. The next morning dawned pale and uncertain. Ellie crept downstairs, bracing for the worst, but Hank was already up, coffee steaming on the counter. He didn't speak, but he didn't look angry either. For a long moment they just stood there, the silence charged and strange. Finally, Hank cleared his throat. "I read your journal," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to, but I did." Ellie's face flushed hot. She stared at her hands, bracing for him to yell. But Hank only sighed. "You're braver than I ever was. You got that from your mom, I think." Ellie's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to help." He nodded, his jaw working. "I know. I'll take a look at the cat's leg later." "You did good, Ellie. Maybe better than I would have." She could hardly believe it. Hope bloomed in her chest, fragile and new. That afternoon, as the sun poured through the kitchen window, Hank sat by the fire, lost in thought. He pulled out an old photograph of himself as a boy, clutching that long-ago fawn, and ran his thumb over the faded image. Maybe there was room left for kindness, even after all these years. In the shed, Bruno rested, his breathing easy, his wound nearly healed. For the first time, Ellie felt the heavy wall between her and Hank begin to crumble. Not all at once, but a little at a time, like ice thawing under the spring sun. That night, as the fire crackled, Hank sat with Ellie, no words needed. They watched the flames, side by side, a quiet understanding blooming. Maybe forgiveness didn't come all at once. Maybe it was built, page by page, in the firelight. It started with wind, first a whisper, then a roar. The day had been clear, the sun glinting off wet leaves, but as dusk settled, clouds rolled over the hills like a warning. By evening, the sky had darkened to slate and the air turned sharp, bristling with static. Ellie had been in the kitchen, setting the table while Hank chopped carrots for stew. A nervous energy filled the house, both of them jumpy, as if some part of the storm from the night Bruno was found had returned. Just as Hank poured broth into the pot, a branch snapped outside. The lights flickered, then steadied. They froze, listening. The old shed's door thumped against its frame. Ellie's heart dropped into her stomach. "I should check on Bruno," she blurted, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Hank looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll come with you. If this wind keeps up, no telling what might happen." They donned rain jackets and stepped out into the night. The air was wild, gusts whipping Hank's hat off and driving rain into their faces. The woods swayed, trees creaking and groaning like old bones. Ellie clutched the flashlight, its beam darting across the swirling dark. The shed was just yards away, but in the storm, it felt like a mile. As they neared, a sudden gust tore the door wide open. Ellie's flashlight beam swept the interior. Bruno was gone. "No?" Ellie ran inside, searching frantically. The towel bed was empty. Bits of fur clung to the rags, the water bowl upturned. Outside, the wind howled, carrying away the scent, the trail, everything. "He's not here," Ellie shouted above the storm, her voice thin and desperate. Hank stood in the doorway, rain dripping off his nose, his face grim. He must have panicked. These storms, they drive creatures out of hiding. Ellie spun, grabbing her grandfather's arm. "We have to find him. He's still hurt. He could die out there." Hank hesitated, old instincts warring in his eyes. Then, with a grim set to his jaw, he nodded. "Get the big flashlight from the porch. I'll check for tracks." They set out into the darkness, the beam from the heavy flashlight slicing the woods. Every tree seemed to move. Shadows leapt and vanished. Branches whipped at their faces. Ellie called Bruno's name, voice cracking, searching the tangled undergrowth for any sign. A paw print, a flash of spotted fur, golden eyes. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the woods in cold white for a heartbeat. Rain lashed down, soaking Ellie to the bone. Her sneakers slipped in the mud as she scrambled over logs and through brambles. "Hank!" she cried, her voice swept away by the wind. For a terrifying moment, she was alone. The woods a spinning chaos of wet leaves and black trunks. Then a distant shout, Hank's voice, hoarse but clear. "Ellie, over here!" She stumbled toward the sound, heart pounding. Ahead, in the hollow beneath a massive fir, she found her grandfather kneeling in the mud, coat thrown over something small and trembling. Bruno. He was crouched low, pressed against the earth, eyes wide with terror. Mud caked his fur. He hissed when Hank moved, but there was no strength in it, just fear. Ellie dropped to her knees beside them, reaching out with shaking hands. "Bruno. It's me, it's okay. I'm here." Bruno's eyes flicked to her. Recognition flared. He made a tiny, exhausted sound, somewhere between a whimper and a purr. Hank held Bruno's gaze, breathing hard. The two locked eyes, a wild animal and a weathered man, both battered by storms outside and within. For a long moment, nothing else existed. Ellie watched as her grandfather's hand, gnarled and strong, trembled above the bobcat's head. The old fear was still there. The memory of loss, of pain, of a life turned hard by grief. But something in Hank's face changed. The hardness softened. The hand dropped gently, the coat wrapped around Bruno's shivering body. "He's just scared," Hank said quietly, almost to himself. "Not mean. Not tonight." Ellie blinked tears from her eyes. The wind howled overhead, but there in the hollow, everything was still. She helped Hank lift Bruno, careful not to jostle his injured leg. Together they made their way back through the wild night, the flashlight's beam wobbling ahead, Bruno bundled safe between them. Back at the cabin, they dried Bruno as best they could and set him in front of the stove. The bobcat blinked at the warmth, shivering, then settled into the towel bed Ellie made. Hank stood over him, arms crossed, the firelight catching on his wet face. "He's not our enemy," he said, voice rough. "He's just lost, like the rest of us." Ellie smiled through her tears. In that moment, she felt something old and heavy fall away. Not just her fear for Bruno, but the wall that had stood between her and Hank since the day she arrived. They sat together in the soft light, listening to the storm rage outside. Their small family made whole again, human, wild, and everything in between. That night, as the world battered their little cabin, Hank and Ellie both realized that forgiveness, of others and of themselves, could be as fierce as any storm, and just as necessary for survival. Morning arrived wrapped in quiet after the storm. The woods sparkled, every blade of grass and pine needle glittering with dew. Ellie woke from uneasy dreams, blinking at the golden stripes of sunlight falling across her bed. She listened. The wind had died, and the house was calm. Downstairs, she heard the low creak of Hank's chair, the steady sound of him stirring sugar into his coffee. But it was Bruno she worried about most. She slipped from bed, pulled on her boots, and hurried downstairs. Hank looked up as she entered, his face unreadable. For a moment, there was just the sound of the clock ticking, the air still heavy with the memory of the previous night. "Is he okay?" Ellie asked, her voice small. "He's up," Hank answered. "Looks like he wants to walk." Ellie hurried to the tool shed, Hank trailing behind. Inside, Bruno was awake and alert, stretching his healing leg and sniffing the air with a cautious curiosity. His eyes met Ellie's, and she saw both trust and wildness glinting back at her. She knelt beside him, stroking the soft fur behind his ears. "Hey, big guy, you made it." Bruno licked her hand, then padded to the door, pausing to look back at both Ellie and Hank. For the first time, he seemed restless, no longer just surviving, but yearning for something more. "He wants out," Hank said, voice gentle. Ellie's heart clenched. She remembered the promise she'd made, to help Bruno no matter what. But she'd never thought about the end, about what came next if he survived. Now the choice felt like a stone in her chest. All morning, she sat beside Bruno, watching him pace the tool shed. She told him stories, the way she used to when he was sick, but his golden eyes kept drifting to the narrow shaft of sunlight by the door. Each time a bird sang or a twig snapped outside, Bruno's ears pricked, body tensed with longing. Hank watched from the doorway, his arms folded but his face softer than Ellie had ever seen it. At last, he came and sat beside her, knees popping as he knelt to Bruno's level. "Sometimes, love isn't about holding on," he said quietly. "It's about knowing when to let go. Bruno belongs to the wild. If we keep him here, we might heal our loneliness, but we take away his chance to live as he was meant to." Ellie stared at the floor. "But he's safe here. He's part of our family." Hank nodded. "I know, kiddo. But think about how scared he was, how hard he fought to get back to the woods, even hurt. That's where he's free. You gave him that chance. You saved his life. That's what real love looks like, Ellie. It doesn't keep things locked up no matter how much we want to." Ellie felt tears sting her eyes. She'd lost so much in coming here. Her home, her parents' easy laughter, the friends she'd left behind. Letting go of Bruno felt like one more loss, another door closing. But as she looked at Bruno, strong again, tail flicking, she knew Hank was right. She reached out, cupping Bruno's face in her hands. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "Promise me you'll remember us." Bruno nudged her gently, a soft chuff rumbling in his chest. Hank placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's shoulder. "We'll do it together." That afternoon, they prepared a crate lined with soft towels and set out toward the edge of the woods. The sun was high, dappling the path with light. The air was filled with the scent of pine and wet earth. Ellie carried Bruno, cradling him against her chest, while Hank walked beside her, a silent pillar of strength. At the forest's edge, Ellie hesitated. She placed Bruno's crate on the ground and opened the door. For a moment, Bruno stood still, nose twitching, golden eyes wide with wonder. "Go on, Bruno," Ellie said softly. "This is your home now." Bruno stepped out, paws sinking into the damp moss. He turned, looking at Ellie, then at Hank. In that quiet moment, the three of them were bound by something deeper than fear, older than regret. Ellie felt a strange, bittersweet pride. She was giving Bruno the gift of freedom, even as it broke her heart. Hank knelt beside her, his hand warm and steady. "You did good, Ellie, real good." They watched as Bruno padded into the trees, his coat shining in the dappled sunlight. He paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back one last time. Ellie swallowed the lump in her throat and waved. "Thank you, Bruno," she whispered, "for letting me help you." As the bobcat melted into the green shadows, Ellie sat down beside Hank. The woods seemed quieter now, not empty but at peace. She leaned into her grandfather, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. For a long time they sat in silence, watching the wind ripple the ferns, listening to the birds call. Ellie felt her sadness ease, replaced by something lighter. She'd kept her promise. She'd chosen what was right, not what was easy. Hank squeezed her shoulder. "Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, Ellie. It means loving enough to trust that what you set free will carry a part of you wherever it goes." Ellie nodded, wiping her tears. She realized then that love, real love, wasn't about possession or safety. It was about respect, about having the courage to set others free, even when it hurt. As they walked back to the cabin, the world felt bigger, full of loss and hope, of wildness and healing. Ellie knew she'd never forget Bruno, or the lesson he'd taught her. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is let go. Dawn crept softly over the Oregon hills, mist rising from the soaked ground in ghostly ribbons. Ellie woke early, the ache in her chest reminding her that this day would be different from all the rest. The bed felt too big, the house too quiet. Even the birds outside seemed to call out in lower, gentler tones, as if they too understood what was about to happen. She dressed in silence, pulling on her boots and an old sweatshirt of her father's she'd found at the back of the closet. She paused for a long time at her window, looking out at the glistening woods. Last night, after Bruno's release, she'd barely slept, memories and longing swirling behind her eyes like the wind in the trees. Downstairs, Hank was already awake, standing at the stove with 2 mugs of cocoa steaming on the counter. He looked over his shoulder, the morning light catching the new softness around his eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. Ellie shook her head, sitting down beside him at the kitchen table. "I kept thinking about Bruno. Do you think he's okay?" Hank slid a mug toward her, then sat across from her. For a moment, they just sat in the stillness, sipping cocoa, watching the last wisps of fog drift past the window. "He's a survivor, Ellie," Hank said finally. "You helped make sure of that. He'll remember." She wanted to believe him. In her heart, she hoped Bruno was already running beneath the giant ferns, leaping over fallen logs, sniffing the crisp air, free in the world where he belonged. They packed quietly, gathering what little they needed. Ellie tucked the blanket Bruno used into the crate and slipped her journal into her backpack, pen tucked between the pages. Hank handed her a pair of thick gloves, just in case. It was a simple walk to the edge of the forest, but every step felt heavy, weighted by memories, both old and newly made. The sun was rising now, gold and bright through the mist, painting the wet world in 1,000 shades of hope. As they walked, neither spoke, but there was comfort in the shared silence. Hank carried the crate. Ellie walked beside him, one hand resting on top. She wanted to say 1,000 things. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I love you." But the words caught somewhere deep, too big for her mouth. At the forest's edge, they stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. They set the crate down, opening the door wide. For a moment, There was only the sound of water dripping from the leaves, the soft thump of Ellie's heart in her ears. Ellie crouched beside the open crate, running her fingers over the faded towel. "This is it, Bruno. Time to go home." A shadow flickered between the trees. Ellie blinked, half thinking she'd imagined it, but then she saw him. Bruno, cautious but whole, his fur gleaming, his green-gold eyes wide with wonder. He sniffed the air, pausing at the edge of the trees. He didn't dart away. He approached with slow, tentative steps, nose quivering. Ellie held her breath as Bruno padded forward, stopping just in front of her. For a moment, Wild and human gazed at each other in perfect stillness, a silent conversation that needed no words. She reached out, letting her hand rest on the mossy earth between them. Bruno sniffed her fingers, eyes soft, then brushed his head gently against her hand. Tears slid silently down Ellie's cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for trusting me." Hank knelt beside her. He didn't try to touch Bruno, just watched, awe and pride mingling on his weathered face. For a long second, Bruno's gaze shifted from Ellie to Hank, then back again. In that glance, Hank saw something he hadn't felt in decades: forgiveness. Not just for the animal, but for himself. For all the ways he'd hardened, for all the things he'd lost and feared to lose. Bruno stepped back, pausing at the threshold of the trees. He looked back once, at Ellie, at Hank, at the life he'd briefly shared with them. Then, with a final flick of his tail, he disappeared into the ferns, the shadows swallowing him whole. The silence that followed was sacred. Ellie pressed her hand to her mouth, half sobbing, half smiling. Hank put his arm around her, pulling her close. The two of them sat together at the edge of the world, breathing in the sharp, sweet air, the ache of parting tempered by the joy of having loved and let go. For Ellie, the tears that fell weren't only for Bruno leaving. They were for the little girl she'd been when she arrived, lost and scared, longing for connection. For Hank, it was something deeper, a weight lifted, a wound finally given a chance to heal. His pride wasn't for what he'd kept, but for what he'd managed to release, for trusting love again after so many years. As the sun crept higher, Ellie pulled out her journal. She wrote with shaking hands, words tumbling out in a rush. "I never thought letting go could feel so right. Bruno taught me more than I ever imagined, about courage, trust, and what it means to be free. I think I understand Grandpa now, and maybe he understands me. Sometimes love isn't about holding on, but about giving someone a chance to be themselves, even if it means saying goodbye." She closed the journal, tucking it against her heart. Hank helped her to her feet, and together they walked home through the waking forest. The trees were alive with morning bird song, the world bright and new. Ellie glanced at Hank, saw the small, proud smile on his face, and knew she'd never forget this day, not for as long as she lived. A new chapter was waiting. The legacy of compassion they'd built together would outlast any storm. There are stories that end quietly, slipping away like mist at sunrise. But some stories leave a mark, etched in the heart, carried forward into every new day. Ellie's story with Bruno was one of those. The sun was higher now, the morning bright and alive, and for the first time since arriving in Oregon, Ellie felt a sense of belonging she couldn't quite put into words. Back at the cabin, everything looked both familiar and transformed. The kitchen table, once a battleground of unspoken fears, was now a place of peace. Hank had made pancakes, lopsided and a little burnt, but the best Ellie had ever tasted. They ate together, trading quiet smiles and inside jokes. Each moment felt precious, a reward for all they had endured. When breakfast was over, Hank disappeared out to the porch, mug in hand, whistling an old tune Ellie didn't recognize. She stayed behind, settling at the kitchen table with her journal and a fresh cup of cocoa. The window was open, the song of robins drifting in with the scent of pine and earth. The world outside was wide and wild, but in this little kitchen, Ellie felt calm, safe, ready to write her own next chapter. She opened her journal and began. This isn't just a story about a bobcat. It's about finding family in unexpected places, about what it means to be brave, not by fighting, but by trusting. Bruno showed me that real love isn't about keeping someone safe for yourself. It's about letting them be free, even if you're scared. He healed more than just his own wounds. He helped heal mine and Grandpa's too. Ellie paused, staring at her words, realizing how much had changed. She thought about the first stormy night, the loneliness, the fear, the way Hank's pain had built walls between them. Now there was understanding, a fragile but growing trust, and underneath it all, something like pride. She drew a little bobcat paw print at the bottom of the page, then started a new one. This time her writing was for someone else, not just for herself, but for anyone who might be listening, or who might one day feel as lost as she once did. If you're reading this, and you've ever had to say goodbye, to a friend, to a pet, or even just to a version of yourself you used to know, I hope you remember what I learned. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means you were brave enough to love with your whole heart, even knowing it might break. If you've been comforted by someone, person, or animal, give them a hug today. And if you've had your own wild moment of trust, or learned something important from an animal, share your story with someone who needs it. You never know whose heart you might help heal. A warm breeze fluttered the page. Ellie smiled, thinking of Bruno, wild and free somewhere in the woods, carrying a piece of her heart with him. She thought of the people she missed, the life she'd left behind in the city. It didn't seem so far away now, not with all she'd gained. She realized she was no longer just surviving, she was living. Later that morning, Hank joined her at the table, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Writing more adventures?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice. Ellie grinned. "Maybe. Or maybe just trying to remember the important parts." Hank nodded, pulling out his old photo album, flipping to the picture of himself as a boy with the rescued fawn. He slid it across to Ellie. "You come from a long line of soft hearts," he said. "Nothing wrong with that." They spent the afternoon together, fixing the fence and stacking wood for winter, but everything felt lighter, as if the house itself had learned to breathe again. Ellie noticed how Hank talked more. Stories about her dad as a kid, about his old dog Rusty, about mistakes and second chances. She listened, realizing that everyone has hidden corners, and that sometimes healing starts simply by sharing them. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the woods shimmered in gold, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, journal open, pen in hand. She wrote her final message for the day, a note not just for herself, but for anyone who stumbled onto her story. Maybe the world needs more people willing to care. Maybe that's what makes a place home. When you let yourself trust and be trusted in return. Bruno taught us that. Grandpa did too. If you're scared or lonely or just not sure you belong, hang in there. The wildest hearts sometimes have the most to teach us about being human. She closed the journal, a smile blooming as she listened to the sounds of Hank humming on the porch, and the birds settling in the trees. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges, new fears, maybe even more losses. But she also knew she could face them, because she was not alone. Ellie stood, stretching toward the window. Somewhere out in the dusk, she imagined she heard the faintest echo of a wild call, a bobcat's cry, not of pain, but of life. She pressed her hand to the glass, whispering a thank you to the woods, to Bruno, to the old hurts that had turned into new beginnings. If you've listened to our story, thank you for being part of it. Don't forget to share your own. Like and follow, and let's keep these gentle lessons alive, together. As the stars blinked awake above the treetops, Ellie closed her eyes and breathed deep. The wild, the healing, the hope. It was all still there, waiting to be written into new pages again and again.